Our last topic is humans in the 21st century. Human knowledge and the capacity to adapt to a changing world are embedded in languages and cultures and are reflected in the objects created by human activity. Collections-based research investigates the complex ecological and societal forces affecting human societies, knowledge systems, and environmental interactions to help understand the threats and the potential for resilience in this era of anthropogenic change. Shared stewardship, community access, and ethical returns of collections shape our research, support Indigenous and historically marginalised communities during this time of global change. An amazing example of the research that highlights this topic comes from our final speaker, Dr. Audrey Lin. Audrey is a paleogeneticist and a Gerstner bioinformatics and computational biology postdoctoral scholar at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. Between 2020 and 2023, she was based here in the anthropology department at the National Museum of Natural History, where she held a Peter Buck postdoctoral fellowship and the George Birch postdoctoral fellowship in theoretical medicine and affiliated theoretical science. While at NMNH, she led several collections-based projects, including two with the aim of recovering viral RNA from museum specimens to better understand the molecular evolution of zoonotic viruses of biomedical interest. We can all think of a recent time when that was extremely top of mind for all of us. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Audrey Lin to give our final scientific talk of the day.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Rebecca, so much for the lovely introduction. And good afternoon, and it is an absolute pleasure and an honor for me to be here with all of you today to share research that I had led while I was a fellow here. And this research that was conducted during the pandemic, and it wasn't initially planned at all, it had culminated in the publication of an article in Science last December. And again, it would not have been made possible without the support of all of my wonderful colleagues here, as well as the support of the Buck Foundation and all of you brilliant people here at the NMNH. So on to the research itself. It's about dogs, specifically dogs in the Pacific Northwest. They are ubiquitous in the archaeological record in the Pacific Northwest, and they also remain an important part of the region's indigenous communities. And this includes the Coast Salish, who are a large group of ethnically and linguistically related peoples living in southwestern British Columbia and northwestern Washington State. And there are more than 40 Coast Salish nations and tribes with more than 20 distinct languages. And within these territories, according to the archaeological canon of the area, there were at least two types of dogs that were kept in these regions. There were short-haired village dogs, or the hunting dog, and also the woolly dog, which was a smaller, a Spitz-like dog, characterized by its long, thick fur. The putative woolly dog remains had been recovered from a large number of archaeological sites, as noted in red here, some dating up to 5,000 years ago. And traditionally, the Indigenous Coast Salish peoples, they had maintained the woolly dog for the production of yarn, which was then incorporated into woven textiles to be used in regalia, blankets, and rugs. And woolly dogs, they were kept because there were no sheep, and mountain goat wool was often difficult to obtain. So these dogs were highly valued. They were fed special diets. They were kept inside of the longhouses with the humans, and they even slept on their own beds that were next to their owners' beds. For some Coast Salish nations, the woolly dogs are emblems for the community, and because long hair is a recessive trait, these dogs are kept separately to prevent from interbreeding with other short-haired dogs. And the Skokomish of President present-day Washington state, they had kept their woolly dogs in pens as represented by these woolly dog puppies inside of these diamond shapes on this basket. Woolly dogs, they were kept by women in the communities, and they were a symbol of wealth and prestige. The more woolly dogs a woman had, the more wealth she had. So the skills in raising the woolly dogs and spinning the yarn and weaving the blankets, they were passed on by women from generation to generation. Weaving is an incredibly important part of Coast Salish culture, and it also defines who they are. And blankets are not only used for warmth, but they are valued in life phase ceremonies where they represent protection. The popular narrative predominant in the literature is that the woolly dog had fell out of fashion with the use of cheaper machine-woven Hudson Bay Company blankets. But this narrative, it undercuts how meaningful and important woolly dogs and weaving are to the Coast Salish. And our interviews with Coast Salish elders and knowledge keepers have revealed a broader colonial policy of cultural repression, which includes repressing traditional power structures held by Coast Salish women, and that includes keeping woolly dogs. So our aim from the beginning of the project is to ensure that the research is more inclusive from an Indigenous perspective as to the history of the woolly dog. And with the help of Liz Hammond-Karima, a master spinner from Nanaimo, British Columbia, who has worked with the Coast Salish communities for decades, we had established an advisory group of a number of Coast Salish peoples from different nations and tribes, and they are leaders and educators in their communities. And this advisory group had advised us throughout the research process. And I would say that about 90% of this work was all done over Zoom and email, and the rest was in person. So this project was quite interesting and challenging in ways to me as someone whose background is not originally in cultural anthropology. We had to mediate the collaboration in a way that respected the wishes of Coast Salish and also the scientists who are on this project. And so although this Coast Salish advisory group was a guide, we are ultimately a consortium, a collective of peoples, all with different knowledges and different strengths, all working towards the common goal of learning more about the woolly dog and sharing the knowledge with each other. So, the only known pelt of the woolly dog is in the NMNH collections belonging to mutton, who was named for by George Gibbs, an ethnographer and a naturalist who had collected specimens for the Smithsonian while he was part of the Northwest Boundary Survey. And mutton was most likely acquired somewhere here around Stolo territory in modern-day Chilliwack, British Columbia. Karen Carr, a scientific artist whose works are featured in many museums across the country, including this one here, she had generously volunteered her time and her formidable talents to create a reconstruction of mutton. And here's Karen here on Zoom, on the screen, directing me and Missy Hawkins, who is the mammal curators here at NMNH, in measuring mutton's pelt. Karen also took phenotypic elements from mutton's pelt and had incorporated them with data from archaeological woolly dog skeletons in order to create this absolutely gorgeous reconstruction of mutton. So this figure here shows the kind of osteometric methods that are predominant in archaeological studies of dogs in the Pacific Northwest. And up until now, the only way to determine whether a dog is a smaller woolly dog or a larger village or hunting dog is by looking at the measurements of their bones. And this figure was made by Ian McKechnie, and he took the metatarsal 4 measurements of mutton and had compared it to measurements from Susan Crockford's so-called type 2 dogs, which are archaeological village or hunting dogs, and so-called type 1 dogs, which are archaeological woolly dogs. And you can see that the metatarsal 4 length of the village dogs are generally longer than those of the archaeological woolly dogs, and mutton's metatarsal 4 falls within the distribution of the archaeological village dogs. but we have a pelt of mutton, and he clearly is not a short-haired dog. And also, in archival records, he was identified as the type of dog whose hair was used for textiles by the Coast Salish. So this analysis shows that you can't go by the classical morphometric characters when differentiating between different dog types. You need other forms of data, so this is where the power of genomics comes in. So we had performed whole genome sequencing on mutton and had come up with 3.4x coverage across his nuclear genome. This is a mitochondrial time tree of mitochondrial genomes from more than 200 modern and ancient dogs. And this essentially shows how these different genomes relate to each other using this Bayesian method of creating a tree-like model. And it estimates how many years ago in time did their ancestors diverge from each other. So we see that mutton is grouped with other pre-colonial dogs that are found only in the Americas and are now extinct after the introduction of European dogs. Zooming up on the tree, within the pre-colonial mitochondrial grouping, we find that mutton's woolly dog lineage is estimated to be between 1,800 and 4,800 years old. In order to further explore mutton's ancestry, I had performed something called F3 outgroup statistics. And this figure shows the results of these tests with ancient and modern dogs with the greatest affinity or similarity to mutton. So the more to the right, the greater the similarity to mutton. And the black points on this figure represents the individual dogs, and the different colors of the horizontal lines are the different dog populations. And by a long shot, mutton is most similar to the ancient pre-colonial dogs here in black, including a 4,500-year-old dog from Port-au-Choix, Newfoundland, and a 1,000-year-old dog from the Weyanoke Hatch site in Virginia. Since mutton post-dates European colonization, I then tested for the presence of genetic ancestry from other introduced lineages using something called D-statistics. And this is essentially to explore whether there's ancestry in mutton's genome which is not pre-colonial, but from a different dog population, like dogs from Africa or the Arctic. So on this figure, the more to the right, the more positive the result, the more the test dog is similar to mutton. The more to the left, the more negative the result, the more the test dog is similar to the pre-colonial dog. And we found that mutton's non-pre-colonial ancestry most likely stems from introduced European dog breeds, which you see with the bright aqua lines here on the far right. And the dogs that are most like the pre-colonial dogs overall are dogs from Sahel, like the dingo. And this is because of the shared ancestry that dingoes have with pre-colonial dogs back in Asia. Okay, so the next step then is to refine these results. Can we estimate how much of mutton's genome is comprised of pre-colonial and Euro ancestry? And I had performed additional population genetic analysis and had found that mutton is 84% pre-colonial dog and about 16% modern European dog. And he is also 100% good boy, but that is, of course, inferred. So next, to investigate the genetic mechanisms for woolliness, I had performed selection analyses or analysis of DNDS ratios on mutton and had compared him to other dogs and canids. So the DNDS ratio that's higher than 1, which indicates positive selection, is on the y-axis. The x-axis is where the genes are located on the 37 chromosomes in the dog genome. And the black and the colored dots are the 125 genes that we found that are greater than 1 in mutton and are 0 in other dogs, which shows that these genes are positively selected for in mutton. And these genes include at least 28 that are associated with biological process linked with hair and skin phenotypes, including KANK2 and KRT77, which are 2 genes noted in these arrows here that are linked to hair follicle development and woolly hair in humans. And these results then show that the unique phenotype of woolly dogs were developed by the Coast Salish peoples over millennia of dog management. So woolly dogs, they were disappearing by the time that mutton had lived, and by 1857, in the Stoa territory where mutton was most likely acquired, the settler population had consisted of only a few dozen people, mainly fur traders. However, when Gibbs had acquired mutton, more than 33,000 miners had flooded into present-day British Columbia as part of the Fraser River gold rush, and this had set off conflicts between the miners, the colonial governments, and the Indigenous peoples. The partial contribution of European ancestry in mutton's genome, it reflects this turbulent moment in history. Smallpox epidemics, almost one in every generation from the 1700s to 1862, are estimated to have killed more than 90% of people in many coastal villages. And once the caretakers of the dogs had passed away, it was difficult to take care of the dogs. The Coast Salish, they are disenfranchised and their cultural practices were criminalized. Indigenous women in Canada were particularly targeted, and Rena Point Bolton, a Stoa Nation elder, she had told us how her great-grandmother had kept woolly dogs but was forced to give them up. They were told they couldn't do their cultural things. There was the police, the Indian agent, and the priests. The dogs were not allowed. She had to get rid of the dogs. The transference of cultural knowledge was also further disrupted by mandatory residential schooling, which involved the removal of children from their families and prohibiting languages other than English. Yet, despite all of these burdens, despite all of this, traditional weaving knowledge was passed on in secret. Traditional knowledge survived. In the last 50 years, there had been revivals of Coast Salish weaving in communities in both British Columbia and Washington State. And this slide here shows two of our co-authors. They are extraordinary Coast Salish master weavers, Deborah Sparrow, who is on her way to covering the entire city of Vancouver in blankets, and Dr. Susan Pavel, the president of the Coast Salish Wool Weaving Center. So our Coast Salish Consortium is very busy with all sorts of projects sharing the knowledge of the woolly dog and Coast Salish weaving, and one of them is a nonprofit documentary which is being produced at the request of our Coast Salish collaborators. This film is being completed by members of the Coast Salish community as well as volunteers, including Kirk French and Neil Hutchison, who are Emmy-nominated anthropological filmmakers. And we are currently working with the Anneman H development and we're currently working with the museum and also with members, stakeholders in the Coast Salish communities in fundraising for this project and for more substantial community-based outreach and knowledge-sharing events on site in the Pacific Northwest. So when we were doing interviews for our paper, a journalist had asked Skokomish elder Michael Pavel, what did this work bring to the Coast Salish? And Michael had said, the work associated with producing the article brought forth validation and respect for our traditional knowledge, and it uplifts our spirits to acknowledge that Western science approaches do value our ancestral teachings. If we weave together Western science with traditional ancestral knowledge, we become stronger. And although each exists in its own right, together it allows us to reach higher levels of consciousness and cognitive understanding. So I would like to again thank all of my Coast Salish colleagues as well as all of my wonderful collaborators for sharing their knowledge and expertise on this project. And thank you very much for your time and your attention, and let's bring back the Salish woolly dogs.
Yes, I saw in one of the slides there was, I think when you're collecting data, you had a bio bubble. Could you elaborate on what that is and why it was necessary?
Yeah, so in the Museum Support Center in Suitland, Maryland, we have an ancient DNA lab, which is in a self-contained, positive, pressurized laboratory unit, and it's necessary to do ancient DNA work in such facilities in order to minimize the risk of modern contamination in this kind of work. The greatest risk to doing ancient DNA work and retrieving DNA from bones, from mummies, from teeth, from all sorts of substrates is contaminating it with modern DNA, which is so much more abundant in the environment than the ancient DNA, which is highly fragmented. So this is why we do the work in there. And yeah, it was done in there. It's a great facility.
Thank you for a wonderful talk, and I like the pictures of the woolly dogs. Could you, I guess, two questions. One, could you do similar analyses on the ancient DNA from other artifacts if there was permission from other Coast Salish groups or whatever to use a blanket to analyze and see where that fur is from, what that dog looked like, or where it what its ancestry would be, and then could you also use that to then compare with the DNA of, say, dogs from further up the coast in Southeast Alaska or other places to see were there common ancestors or trading going on between these different peoples?
Thank you for that question. Yes, in short, to both of your questions, yes. Yes and yes. Our collaborators are very enthusiastic about the possibility of doing such genomic analyses on blankets, textiles that are in museum collections, including a number of blankets that we have in NMNH's anthropological collections. And the quality of DNA that can be retrieved is more of an open question, but hypothetically, it can be done. And the great thing about having mutton's genome is that we have a point of reference in what a woolly dog's genotype looks like. So we can use mutton as a comparison in assessing how closely related or how divergent these other dogs are, because we have no idea how expansive and how diverse these dogs were within this region over the span of thousands of years. And yeah, so definitely there may have been trading going on, but we don't know, again, we don't know the extent of that.
So not to sound too Jurassic Parky, but can we bring back the woolly dog?
So when it comes to like literal sort of cloning, like Dolly the sheep, the answer is no. However, what we can do is take the dogs that exist today and selectively breed them so that they resemble the woolly dog. And there are efforts in several Coast Salish communities undertaking this now. And yeah, this is something that that they are really looking forward to.
Terrific, Audrey. Thanks so much for your talk, and congratulations to the entire team. And I particularly appreciated the development of the consortium, the cultural consortium. That's so very important in anthropological work. My question is whether your research ended up finding any evidence of possible hybridization between the village dog and the woolly dog. And my point of reference here is that at least in some primates, in baboon hybrid zones, for example, you can have actually the skeletal characteristics of one lineage and the pelage characteristics of another lineage combined in the hybrid zone. And so I was just wondering if there's any evidence of that.
Sure. So not exactly like that. However, so I didn't mention in the talk, there was another dog pelt. It was of a village dog, a short-haired village dog. Well, it wasn't short-haired, but it definitely wasn't woolly-haired. It kind of looks like an Irish setter, but it came from the same region around the same time point, and also was sent to the museum by George Gibbs. So we had also sequenced the genome of that dog and compared his genome to mutton, and that dog was definitely predominantly European ancestry, but he also did have some shared ancestry with mutton's pre-colonial lineage, a lot closer than what you expect, despite them looking so different. So yeah, I think that so with dogs, it doesn't take much for them to breed with each other, and which is why there was such stringency in keeping the different dog populations, the dog types, separate. And the fact that mutton was able to persist looking the way that he did with so much pre-colonial ancestry, really, so far late in time, it really is a testament to how the Coast Salish had persisted in maintaining their traditions as long as possible.
That's tremendously interesting, the idea that there could be cultural isolating mechanisms for the two genomes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Audrey. What an extraordinary wait and a wonderful day. And Logan Kissler was Audrey's mentor when she was here. And you also saw Missy Hawkins, the mammal curator, who contributed a lot to that project too.